no worries at all.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And again, I apologize, I interrupted you. You were in a flow.
Well, and I was going to ask, I think you said you had there were some questions that got kind of passed around. And I mean, I'd just love to even just talk more about pajamas and other things that you're doing there, and you know, what you're working on in terms of accessibility within the design system and that kind of thing. So I'd love to just know more and even answer some of those questions directly from the doc.
Sure. Yeah, we can cover the doc. There weren't a whole lot of questions. There were about 5. One of the themes that really came up was around personas for accessibility. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what has the effect been like when you introduce those personas for access needs, and if we were to do that, what would you recommend how we approach it?
So experience is mixed. The value of a persona is partly in the end result, but I think the bigger value of a persona is the work that goes into creating them and the research that you do to make that happen. And so what we find is people tend to look at accessibility personas in like 2 different ways. One is they create an accessibility persona, which is like, here's Dave, the guy that's in the wheelchair, and they focus on that. They don't focus on, this is Dave that is doing data entry for such and such an organization, and one of the things that he happens to need is, you know, ridiculous keyboard efficiency. You know, when we don't, so we see a lot of things where the focus with personas is on the disability, and that actually partly, I don't know, I want to say that it doesn't usually go towards creating the culture that you're actually after. What it tends to do is create a, you know, this is Dave who's in a wheelchair. This is, you know, Ramji who uses a screen reader, whatever. We start to then find that those personas encourage people to solve for the assistive technology that they use, rather than thinking about, you know, broader issues. And so sometimes they have kind of a negative effect. The other is, what people often do is they have an existing persona that is, you know, whomever, and whatever their role is and what their behaviors are, and then they just kind of tack on some accessibility, you know, need to it that doesn't even necessarily resonate or fit with that person, particularly if that persona was a representative of somebody real. Then we've suddenly put in something that doesn't really fit. So the way to do it right, in my estimation, is that we should be doing a lot more with inclusive design that actually helps inform and generate those personas, so that they're real, so that there's more empathy is kind of a loaded word, but that there's more empathy with this as a real person, rather than it being you know, somebody that's there on paper, that this is a real person and here's the stories behind it. So I think, you know, personas, it really all depends on how you're using them, and so I would say the you know, the best path forward is a focus on inclusive design, which means that we're actually talking with real developers and managers and other people that are using GitLab about the things that they do and the challenges that they face for real, and not just made up little things that we add on or tack on to an existing persona.
Yeah, I think I feel like you summarized all of my thoughts on accessibility personas really well, because we've been getting a lot of questions as we've been kind of doing more education around accessibility, and like, oh, well, we have these personas, like, do we need to create accessibility personas? And it's been like, well, we have these personas that we did a lot of research around, and it doesn't quite feel right to just create separate personas. It also doesn't feel right to just add, you know, things to our existing personas. So
yeah.
Yeah.
to me anyway, I think one of the interesting things that happens is people think exactly like that. Like, oh, do we need some accessibility personas? You don't really, right? Like every single problem that a person with a disability is trying to solve, the things that go behind their motivations, their behaviors, and the things that they're doing, those are about the tasks and the things that they're trying to achieve. It has nothing to do with their disability. They just happen to use a different set of tools maybe to make that happen. There are some times when the way that the way that somebody with a disability might think about a problem is different, and in those cases it kind of speaks to more broad generative research. In other words, sometimes we ask people with disabilities specifically about things that are unique to them, about how they approach a problem, because we want to find out how it's different than how people without disabilities try to accomplish a task. So if you think about, I use this example quite a bit, and I might have even been in one of my courses, but we've done I've done a bunch of work over the years with different healthcare provider types or healthcare insurance providers, and they always have like a list. Here's where you can find the healthcare provider, and here's what they specialize in. And you can search for them and sort by distance away from a certain location. And I said to a team one time, I said, have you considered that someone with a disability might actually travel 2 or 3 times as far to get to a place where the ramp where the curb cut to get up to like to the door level is right in front of the door versus 350 feet around the side. Those kinds of things have an impact on how people make their decisions, and those are interesting, because then instead of having a list of healthcare providers and then being able to drill down onto the details page and see what the physical accessibility characteristics are of that building, if we know that people use that to make decisions, we might actually put that on the results page, so they don't have to dive in, dive back out, dive in, dive out to find a location where the ramp is right at the front. So knowing the way that people with certain types of disabilities might actually approach a problem and how they're different, those are the kinds of things that I think we should probably focus on through more inclusive design research and methodologies. So sometimes, yeah, we totally should dive into that, but very rarely is it on the kind of simple, straightforward things. So we have to talk with people with disabilities to find out which those things are, which ones are different. Why do they have to approach this differently? That maybe the way that they manage something within GitLab is way different because they have chronic pain, and therefore they have to batch their tasks differently, and so they approach a workflow differently simply because they have chronic pain. So those are the kinds of things that we probably want to try and figure out, because that will give us much more richness in the way that we approach solving those problems.
We also, oh, Mike, were you going to say something? Go ahead. I saw you unmuted.
Oh no, go ahead. I put my question in the agenda, so go ahead and voice it.
I was just going to ask, in terms of like testing with users who have different disabilities, we've run into kind of a struggle with, well, we don't want to waste their time testing with them when we know we have all of these accessibility concerns that we need to fix first, but we still like trying to balance those two, like having a group of users who are willing to speak with us, and who we can learn from, versus knowing we have all these things that we need to fix already. And so I'm wondering how you've gone about balancing those two things.
Yeah, it's totally a balancing act. The beauty, I'm going to keep coming back to this, I think the beauty of inclusive design is that it's not just about testing. And so we have lots of different ways to engage and lots of different ways to test concepts and prototypes and things. Even though we've got those things right now that we know are issues. Excuse me. All right, have a quick drink. That is not a COVID cough, but I have had like a 7-year chronic cough that I'm starting the process of getting it figured out. It sneaks up on me at times, and we don't know what it is, but we're gonna figure it out. Even things like I think Jeremy, you were saying something about iconography, and the iconography that we use. One of the things that we've found in usability studies in the past is that iconography can have a significant impact on people with low vision, which seems really obvious to say, but that's the kind of thing where we can get that feedback way before we're ever in like high fidelity mockup. We can do that, like, hey, we're coming up with a new icon system. We want to work through this and make sure that these icons make sense. So we're looking at the colors on the icons, the size of the icons, the markings on them, how easy are they to distinguish from one another. And again, that's all stuff that you would expect, but we do it specifically with people with low vision because we know that somebody with low vision has sometimes difficulties distinguishing one icon from another, that color is an issue, and that size has an impact. That we did some work once where the bicycle, I don't know if you've seen it, well, Google has a bicycle icon on their Google Maps, and those icons don't have anything around them. And so we actually were working with a client once that put one of Google's icons and mixed it in with all the rest of their icons. All the rest of their icons, like their own icons, all had like a border around it and were in like a squarish, had a squarish treatment. And the bicycle icon was basically Google's icon, and it wasn't like that. So what we saw happen was people with low vision were actually confusing it, or what wasn't recognizable as an icon because it didn't have the same shape as everything else that they had learned. And the weight of the icon was so thin that the bicycle looked like an O, a V, and an O, and they couldn't figure out what OVO meant. And they're like, they were confusing them with letter forms. They're like, wow, I wish we had found that out like 3 months ago. We really should have found that out 3 months ago. So I guess that's part of the balancing act, is figuring out how we can work with people all the way through the process, what kinds of things are useful to share with them, to get valuable feedback on at different points in the entire process. And in order to do that, we need to think about, not saying that you were thinking this, but one of the messages that I try to hammer home as much as I can is, don't think about people with disabilities just as people that are going to test. Think of them as co-designers, co-creators. And if we do that, we think about them all the way along the process. I did a thing last year where I was asking people questions. I have all these ideas, like, here's how I think I would like you as people with different disabilities to contribute to this project. And I realized pretty quickly that if I'm going to include them as co-creators, before I tell them how I want to include them, I'm going to ask how they would like to be included, to see, they might have ideas on how they could participate that I've never even thought of. And so that, for me, as we move towards inclusive design, that's a pretty important thing, and opens up all kinds of opportunities that we've probably never even thought of, because we're too close to it, and B, we do the work. You kind of get into these habits of doing the work in a certain way. So asking for that perspective, I think, is a useful part of it, right? And how do we take this and actually find a way to have participation all the way through, rather than just at the end when we're testing.
Yeah, that's great. I love asking them how they want to participate. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Thank you for asking. I love talking with people about this kind of stuff because it gets me excited and gets the juices flowing.
Awesome. Cool.
I
Mike,
think
do you wanna ask
my
your
question is kind of a segue to that, where rather than having a separate accessibility inquiry or research track, to have a more inclusive research recruiting process, where when we have an idea, for a design and we're in the solution validation phase, to make sure that we have somebody with access needs in that pool. And then as I'm talking, I realize I don't think we ask that question in any of our participant pool, qualification surveys. I think we'll ask things like, what's your role? What version of GitLab do you have, or what pricing tier? But we don't ask if they have any access needs and what those are. And I'm wondering if, yes, what your thoughts are about that. Asking people if they have access needs so that we know in our pool if we have a more inclusive and complete view of the population in our participant pool.
Yeah, I would say it's very likely that you don't have many or any, because you tend not to have people that, not that it's impossible, but you tend not to unless you're specifically recruiting for it. Ideally, I have, well, as you can imagine, I have opinions about this. I think there's two ways that you can go about it. One is we're looking to establish an end state where in every kind of end validation run that we're doing, if we're going to do a session with, say, 15 people, maybe we have a goal that a third have a variety of disabilities, or maybe up to a half, whatever it is. You can figure out what that number is. Ideally, the way that I've always looked at it is accessibility should be part of everything. So we're going to incorporate people with disabilities into whatever other research studies you're doing. But I also believe that accessibility needs some dedicated time and space to be its own thing. And so, when we're talking with, I built this is literally perfect timing because I just finished this talk. When we're talking with teams about how to do work, I often tell them, yes, accessibility belongs in every sprint. It's part of every feature, it's part of everything. But once a quarter, we should plan for and do an accessibility specific sprint. That brings attention to it. It gets some of the dedicated space and time that it needs, and it allows you to clear the decks of things that have been hanging around that you haven't been able to prioritize, because we all know what happens, right? Even if you prioritize accessibility within your sprints, you're still probably finding that you're doing things that you deem to be the most important, like we're going to nail it on keyboard access, but there may be some other things that get left behind. So I like to think of it as, yes, it should be part of everything, but yes, it should also be its own thing. And so if you're thinking about that from a research perspective, you could do almost exactly the same thing. We have people with disabilities that are incorporated into everything, into all the studies, but we also have some accessibility specific ones that happen with people that are only people with disabilities. So that's one of my opinions on it. My second opinion on it is, there was a time when we were doing a lot of, and I'm saying this like, this is my company from like 2007, 2008, we were doing this work. We were contracted with a client and we were doing usability studies both with and without people with disabilities on the same things. And every time, I say every time, I shouldn't blanket it quite like that, but almost every time, the people with disabilities found the exact same usability issues that people without disabilities found, but they found them faster, they were more prominent, it was like, it was really, really clear and really obvious that, yes, these were usability issues that are going to impact everybody, but people with disabilities found them quicker and they were so much more obvious. So my other opinion on it is, we should only do those kind of studies and do that research only with people with disabilities, because we don't necessarily if we're going to find all the same usability issues anyway, then part of me wants to dig into that and say, what would it be like if we only did that? Because that would be like different than anybody has ever approached it. So that's my second opinion on it. I don't know which one I like the most, but they I think they take top of mind for me depending on who I'm talking to and who's kind of willing to listen and what they want to do, how they want to approach it. So
I think that's really interesting. I know that I'd done just some very light testing with a company in Minnesota here called WeCo, which they employ accessibility testers, if you're familiar with them.
Yeah.
But the results and the way that their testers could communicate the fixes were so much more helpful than I think anybody else could ever communicate it, both in the lack of subjectivity, but also the clarity and how it was found, the test case, everything around it was so clear and so much more helpful. So I do like your thoughts there. That's very interesting. To Mike, to your point. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I was going to say just more about the same thing, and I would probably just repeat myself. So
I was going to say one of the things that we've had difficulty with is just around people opting in to say, yes, I have some kind of an access need, and for legal implications, or we initially looked at, can we have even an internal database of our own team members that opt in, that they could say, hey, I can help with colorblind testing, but legal was like, we really can't do that because of HIPAA and other things of having that documented. So, and we use tools like user testing, and they actually don't include any kind of a category for their testers to include that, hey, I can test these types of scenarios or disabilities. So it has been a challenge in that regard, finding key advocates that we can bring along the way on a project from start to finish at GitLab, and in any effort really. So I wonder if it's appropriate to jump into maybe talks about how you've done that or what your recommendations are there.
Yeah, there's all the HIPAA stuff is, I mean, that's a real thing, that's no joke. And we've actually, we've seen different approaches. One of them is, we don't store any of your information. We recruit for this and this only. But what you do by opting into this mailing list is saying that you want to be contacted every time we do a study, right? So there's different ways of doing it. We don't know any of the details, and they do it. We do a lot of recruiting on Twitter, which definitely has some some self-selection biases to it for sure. But we also do a lot of work where we've done this for, I don't know, probably 15 years, this approach. Almost every national advocacy group has local chapters in places. So we stay in contact with them and talk with them pretty regularly when we can. And we get them to help with recruiting. That way they're sending us people. We can decide, does this person fit the profile of what this client is after, et cetera. So there's definitely ways around it. The other stuff with personal information in general is, and this is not definitive, this is not legal advice, this is, nothing of the sort, but yes, you're part of it. You've answered these questions, but you can tell us at any time that you want to not be part of this anymore. There's no obligation to stay in. There's no obligation to participate. You can change your data at any time. You can have us delete your data at any time. And as part of this, if you would like, we're happy to remove you and keep you on the equivalent of a do not contact list as well. So those things, are all ways to make it happen. And you obviously need to talk with legal about it and and HR to make sure that they're all on board with it. But usually it's about whether or not you're saving that data, and that data can be used in a way that's discriminatory against that person, right? So it's a little bit tricky. A lot of organizations are getting to the point now, though, where they've got their own internal employee resource groups that are focused on disability and inclusion, and so the fact that they are part of that, in some ways, that's, we should ask those questions, like, tell me why not in a confrontational way, but tell me, how did the ERG group manage to do that? What are the factors that allow them to do that in a way that is, that meets requirements and that doesn't violate any of their, their privacy or health information needs, so that we can do the same kind of thing.
Oh, really helpful. We do have like our GitLab First Look, which is our kind of opt-in program that we do with testers. I believe, there's compensation and things that are formalized with that, which is good. And so I think I've looked into it before, but now that I'm hearing what you're saying, I think that there could be some opportunity to go back and maybe make some of those things open-ended. Just, I would like to test with these things, but you never have to, just because I want to test for colorblindness doesn't mean I'm colorblind, or just because I want to do keyboard only doesn't mean I have any, functional needs or whatnot. So I think that's interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I want to make sure this is like two ways, and I know you mentioned you might have some questions about what we're doing for pajamas. So I don't know if we could answer any of your questions. We would be happy to do that too. We could ask you questions all day long.
Yeah, there was one
Good.
just one more question I wanted to squeak in, and that is about common mental disorders. I remember in your course you mentioned there was a persona that I think kind of lumped in autism and anxiety into one persona. And so I'm wondering, what are some considerations you have around those type of like mental disorders?
Yeah, this is the least the least well understood area of accessibility, is anything on the cognitive side, the neurodiversity side, and just overall brain function. The things tend to get grouped into categories, whether it's anxiety related, memory related, literacy related, numeracy related. All of those things kind of they're all kind of functional, and the way that I tend to look at it, and maybe is even different than I did back when I created the course, is it's really about the functional need. So if I struggle with my brother has traumatic brain injury, concussion, massive concussion from a car accident from 5 years ago. His short-term memory is shot, right? That makes it makes no difference that he's got that as a result of a traumatic brain injury, or some other thing that happened, or some other other type of disability. The functional impact is that he has short-term memory related issues. The fact that he's got some visual processing related issues because of the connection between the left side and the right side of his brain and the way that he sees things, that has very little to do with the actual thing that caused it. We just know that he has some visual processing things. So I tend to, when we're doing this, think of what the functional impact is, more than the actual the actual condition or diagnosis or whatever it is. And I'll truthfully say this too. When I put those personas in the course, I was like, I don't even know if I want to put these in for almost this reason. And not that you shouldn't ask the question, but almost for this reason, because it can actually end up being, it can be a distraction. The value in them is that they illustrate that those are pretend people that are culled from, that I've collected from years and years of doing that work with people. So there are kind of, conglomerates of some sort. And in the absence of actually having something else to anchor to, these help. So so I don't know if I actually answered your question or if I avoided it.
You did. As you were talking about functional needs and short-term memory loss, or maybe like vision processing issues, my mind went back to the Nielsen-Norman group usability heuristics. This is kind of more of a case to like follow those. Yeah, I really appreciate what you said too about the personas. I agree, they can be a distraction, and like any other method, they're applicable at a certain time. So maybe in an organization's early stages of adoption of accessibility and the awareness of accessibility, the personas might be a tool. But I could also imagine that you wouldn't really need personas to make progress on improving accessibility. I think the thing that you mentioned about having accessibility improvements every iteration or every sprint, and then having a sprint every quarter where accessibility is a focus, that can have an impact, and you don't have to have personas to pursue those improvements, right? Yeah. No, I really appreciate you humoring me on that question. And yeah, to take it back to Tori's point, we'd love to answer your questions about how we're approaching accessibility in Pajamas, our design system.
Yeah, one of the questions that I had, well, I guess I was trying to figure out where you are on the journey. Like, I don't know how long Pajamas has been around, and where you are on the journey right now. I remember looking at it, thinking about it, and just kind of wondering how accessibility fits into it. I know there's components that are accessible. I didn't see a ton of, I don't think anyway, I've looked at a lot of design systems in the last 3 weeks while I've been putting this talk together. So I don't recall seeing a whole lot of accessibility specific documentation. And so that's one of the things that I've spent quite a bit of time on with different organizations, is the documentation side. So I wanted to dig in a little to that, just to get maybe some of the history of the design system. I think you said, you kind of started it up like a year ago or so, or I'm not sure of the exact timeline, but ultimately how accessibility fits into that, and sort of where you see you are on your journey right now.
Yeah, so we formed the foundations team about a year ago. Previous to that, we were working on the design system like without a formal team.
Gotcha.
And in terms of accessibility, I think within our design system, it really started with the VPAT and the compliance letter, statement of compliance. And then ever since then, we didn't really have any experts or people to kind of contribute more to what that actually looks like and function. And then Jeremy joined the team, and that's when we really started getting like some specific accessibility documentation for specific components. We started introducing audit guides, which Jeremy, you can certainly take over and talk about that. And then also trying to like shift accessibility left and put it more in our processes from the beginning. And then we're kind of working on how do we document that process and ensure that designers are thinking about it throughout the whole process, and not just like a checklist at the end when a component is built. So I think that's kind of where we currently are. Jeremy, did you want to add anything?
I think that's correct. One of our tenets, I think, of when we founded kind of the foundations team was like the style side of things, and obviously that the visual layer was kind of a lot of low-hanging fruit, and then trying to complement it in a few ways where we're doing the education piece and more awareness internally to kind of champion some of these things from accessibility. We've also done more global items from a design system standpoint, where we've addressed color and things like that might bleed into other elements and start to bring up their level of accessibility. And we've created kind of a status and a formula, or a pattern, I should say, to to audit our components now. And that's what we've really begun to shift our weight towards, is auditing them and having kind of a rigor around how do we do both manual and automated and validate. And then from those results that are currently kind of at the beginning stages, we'll be able to go back into Pajamas and document those for each component and say, you know, when you're using this is the expectation, like this is what should happen. This is the behavior. This is the results you should expect. If it doesn't, here's how you troubleshoot. We're also doing some things like creating guides. The only one we have today is like a keyboarding guide where somebody that's maybe new to auditing could go through and be like, okay, how would I even test or look at something from a keyboard perspective? Upping our best practices so that we can say, okay, if you're using items like toast messages or alerts, what's the best practice on how to communicate that content to a user? And so we're kind of shaping it in a few different ways. And then to Jarek's point earlier, going into like our view components and making sure that at the start, everything is there. It's to build these out in accessible ways so that we're using some correct semantics to begin with. We're using, you know, ARIA where it's needed, et cetera. So,
yeah. Cool. So you're making good progress, but there's still a long way to go. There's a lot of education that goes around it and that you're still working on.
Definitely.
Yeah, and to talk about your earlier point about, you know, once we haven't really productized this design system, as you see, you know, if you're getting up and started with a project, you look at open source UI kits for different frameworks and things. And so we've really been focused on using this internally and documenting this for the internal GitLab team. And of course, it's open source, anybody can use it, but it's not like you go to some of these design systems, they give you an NPM package install command and do all these things. So yeah, it's definitely early stages, but I like that we're doing this now. And I did have one question because there's only a few minutes left. I've been coming across a lot of like conflictions in my head around like an accessibility backdoor or side door feature or something in settings that basically enhances accessibility or contrast or what have you. What are your thoughts around like accessible out of the box? And, you know, what are your thoughts on this sort of going into settings and increasing accessibility, if you will? Because I've also, you know, during some of the stuff we've been going through, it's been talking about button touch target size, which is which some of our buttons don't currently meet. So like, are we not meeting that, or is the ability to zoom on the UI and making that button bigger meeting that criteria, if that makes any sense? Because it just feels like we're not meeting some of the criteria, and then I'm getting conflicting messages about, should it be accessible out of the box? Like, should our buttons be to meet this criteria?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of rambling now, but if you kind of get the idea.
Yeah. So there's a couple of like intertwined, you know, subjects in there, but one, I would say accessible out of the box is the way that we should be aiming for everything, right? That should be our default position, unless we have a really well-researched reason that we can stand behind and that we're 100% comfortable with saying we don't need to do it because of X. Like I'm saying that because I'm before some of the rules that were in place now, and I don't even like talking about them as rules, but before some of the guidance that we have was there, I would actually break rules on purpose because I knew it created a better experience for people with disabilities, though, not for people without. So I would say out of the box, accessible. There is a big wave of, it used to be called something else. It used to be called CCPP, which was composite capabilities and personal preferences or something. And there's a new acronym for it now. But the concept is, you know, we're getting to a point where lots of the things that fit in the cognitive realm and the neurodiversity realm are things that are really hard to take into account with a, here's the solution that you need. So there's a lot of one-off solutions that people employ. And so what we're starting to find now is that there is an entire kind of side you said side something earlier and it's got me
Yeah, like a
down
side
that road.
door, like
Yeah, but it's
feedback
almost like
entrance or whatever.
we have the ability now to do things like prefers reduced motion, right? Those are the kind of preferences, prefers reduced motion, prefers a particular contrast, or prefers a particular color scheme, things like that. Sensible and good design around those kinds of preferences are going to continue to happen. What we don't have yet are, like, I don't know how much you use Gmail, but I think you guys are on Google Suite stuff.
Yeah.
So you can, for email, you can set different densities of email messages. So you can have, I think it's like cozy, comfortable, and spacious or something. Like there's 3 different settings that you can use to give yourself some breathing room in your list of mail messages. That kind of work is going to continue as we go down the path of personalization and preferences when it comes to things like target size and touch target size. Ideally, we should set a really good default and be in a position where by default we're still meeting that, but we've actually got other things that we do that allow for somebody to have way bigger buttons. I'll send you an example. One of the things that I created ages ago was, it's on examples.simplyaccessible.com, and there's a growing button on there, so that if you actually, the idea behind it was, some people miss a target not because they can't hit the target, but because they have a tremor or a shake.
Mm-hmm.
And so they might actually miss the target accidentally, even though they're within a X number of pixels of space. And so we created a button. We've never tested it in production, and you'll be able to tell that when you look at the example. But if you click just outside the button actually grows to meet you, rather than struggling to hit the button multiple times. And so that there's a whole bunch of questions that come with that, like when do we do that? When do we assume intent? And how many times does somebody try to click on a button before we grow the button? And then if we grew the button and they were finally successful, shouldn't we present that button to them in the same size the next time? So there's a lot of that work that's kind of going on, and that's going to be a big area for growth in the next, I would say, from now to like 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a lot of experimentation and growth in that aspect of preferences.
Gotcha, thanks.
So I don't think we have too much time left. Should we wrap the recording there?
Yeah, I think Tori has one more question about your talk that you're working on and where it'll be available.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I was just curious, where is the talk? I don't know if you mentioned that earlier or not. If you did, I missed it, but I would love to watch it.
Yeah, it's an Event Apart online summit, the spring, or their spring summit. And that's in like three weeks maybe. So if it's I mean, it is a paid thing. I don't know if they're going to release the videos after, but if you want to go to that and check it out, I mean, you can. It's like 2 or 3 days of stuff. Like there's a million things there. It's ridiculous. But if you want, I have like a discount code as well. If you decide you want to sign up for it, I can send you the discount code.
Yeah, please do. Hopefully someone from our team can come.
Cool.